Good afternoon. Please go ahead and take your seats. My name is Hans Johnson. I'm a demographer and Bren Fellow with the Public Policy Institute of California. And I'm very pleased that you're joining us here today for the briefing on PPIC's latest report on higher education. And I'll introduce our authors in a minute. For those of you who aren't familiar with PPIC, we're a private, not-for-profit think tank. We're based in San Francisco with offices here in Sacramento. Today's event is part of the James Irvine Foundation briefing series, and so I'd like to especially thank the Irvine Foundation for making this event possible. And I'd also like to let you know about some upcoming events that we have. On Monday, this coming Monday, March 24th, PPIC President Mark Baldessari will be in conversation with UC President Janet Napolitano, and that's going to happen over at the Sheraton. Unfortunately, we're sold out, but the event will be webcast live. Secondly, on April 10th at the Sacramento Convention Center, PPIC's Ellen Hannock and her team of water experts will be discussing water finance at a half-day event, which will include three panel discussions of experts. And then finally, on April 21st, we will be back at the Sheraton for an event with Senate President Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg, Assembly Member Melissa Melendez, and CSAC Director Matt Cate on corrections reforms. More information about these programs and ways to register for them is available at PPIC's websites. A few more things before you begin. You should have received an event evaluation form. Please fill this out and return it at the registration desk before you leave. It really helps us figure out what's working and what's not working. The briefing slides from today's presentation will be available on our website on the same page where you registered for the event, and please remember to turn off your cell phones. Okay, so now finally we turn to today's program. We're pleased to have Colleen Moore and Nancy Shulock here with us. They're both with the Institute of Higher Education Leadership and Policy at California State University, Sacramento. As someone who's been helping shepherd this project through and been an editor and reviewer, I have to say it's just been such a tremendous pleasure working with them. They give the rest of us researchers at PPIC a bad name for their promptness and their efficiency, but they've just been fantastic to work with. And I'm sure most of you know iHelp, the center that they're from at Sac State, has really been instrumental in setting the conversation and agenda and bringing research to policy issues in higher education with, of course, a focus on community colleges. And so that I also just appreciate their work besides the work that they've done for PPIC, and I'm sure many of you do as well. So let me welcome Colleen up here now, who will be giving the presentation. And then Nancy Shulock will join Colleen for the question and answer session at the end. Thanks very much. Thanks, Colleen.
Thank you. Thanks to so many of you for coming. And I will preface this by saying I'm a little under the weather, and I'm hoping to get through it without coughing, but patience. So first I'm going to start with some context for what we did here. Okay, so a few years back, all of you are probably familiar with some research PPIC put out about how California needs more college graduates and that we had this potential shortfall of 1 million bachelor's degrees by 2025. And they emphasized in that work the important role of the community colleges in transferring students to help produce those bachelor's degrees. At around the same time, a few years ago, we did a report on California's transfer process, and we identified some problems with how it was working then. Basically, what we concluded was that the process, which was based on this very complex set of campus-to-campus articulation agreements about which courses would transfer from a particular community college to a particular CSU campus in a major, was very complicated for students to follow. It led to a lot of inefficiencies in student course-taking patterns and contributed to low transfer rates. So, often students would take many courses at a community college that didn't end up counting once they got to CSU, or counting at least towards their major requirements, and they were often asked to repeat courses that were similar to things that they had already done. So all of these sort of excess units, lots of people hate that term, but I'll use it anyway, increases the cost of a degree to students and to taxpayers. So, around this time, this is all 2009, 10, this is kind of when all the budget cuts were hitting California and higher education so hard. And so policymakers were interested in both improving student outcomes and in reducing costs. And also at the same time, the then chancellors of the California Community College system and the CSU system were both interested in reforming transfer. Okay, so that set the stage for SB 1440, which passed in 2010. And it had several goals. First, to create clearer transfer pathways for students that would, by virtue of being clear, accomplish two things. It would reduce all these excess units students were taking, and thereby increase capacity, open up seats that other students could fill. Okay. Also, it would incentivize students to complete an associate degree on the way to transfer. That had not historically been the way transfer worked in California. The requirements for completing an associate degree were different often from the requirements for transfer. Completing one didn't really give students any benefit in transferring, then not just, so why would they do it? So very few students, or certainly a minority of students who transferred, had earned an associate degree at a community college prior to doing that. And while graduation rates at CSU for students who transfer are good, there were certainly a not insignificant number of students who would transfer and then not end up completing a bachelor's degree, so they would end up with no degree at all to show for the many years that they had put into college. Okay, so that was another goal, and also just to increase the number of transfers. So those were what we saw as the three goals of SB 1440. So what was in that legislation was that community colleges were required to create associate degrees for transfer, and they would be defined as 60-unit degrees made up of general education requirements and also an 18 units in a major. So sort of the lower division preparation for entering a particular major in the CSU. And students who completed one of those degrees would be guaranteed admission somewhere in the CSU system, not to a specific campus, but somewhere. They would be given priority in admission to a program that was defined as similar to the degree they completed, with definition of similar being left to the CSU campuses. And they would also be guaranteed that they could complete a bachelor's with no more than 60 more units, and that they would not have to repeat any courses that were similar to ones that they had already taken. Okay, so this degree gave these guarantees to students, but it didn't really specify any kind of statewide pattern for doing that. So this could have just resulted in a perpetuation of what we had before, which is all this variation. So each community college could have, for example, come up with its own associate degree for transfer in sociology, and we could have had 112 different ones of those, and each CSU would have had to look at each one of those and decide whether it was similar or not to its own degree. Fortunately, that's not how it played out. The academic senates of the two systems got together and came up with these things called the transfer model curricula, or TMCs. I'll keep using that expression throughout the rest of the presentation. So those TMCs define that 18-unit major. So what coursework is included in the 18 units. Okay, and currently there are 25 TMCs, so 25 disciplines that have a TMC. Okay. So a little time went by, and a couple of years ago there were a couple of progress reports done on how was the implementation of this going. Both the LAO and the Campaign for College Opportunity did that, and they found really that these TMCs had prevented there being variation in the content of these degrees, but it had not prevented variation in there being the number of them that each college would adopt, or how each CSU would decide whether they were similar or not to their own major. There was lots of variation in those two things. And so they expressed concern basically about variation in student access to this new transfer pathway that the state had developed. So as a result of primarily, I think, the LAO's recommendation, the legislature passed another bill just last fall, SB 440, And they expressly said that the goal of it was that the transfer degree becomes the preferred pathway to transfer for all students across the state. Okay, so we're kind of calling that the fourth goal in addition to those three we talked about earlier. So what it did was this requires the community colleges to adopt a transfer degree in every major for which they offer an associate degree anyway. So if a community college offers an associate degree in sociology, you have to offer an associate degree for transfer in sociology. And they put time limits on by when they have to do that. Okay? And it requires the CSUs to make every effort to accept these TMCs into as many concentrations within a major as they can. So, one of the LAO's primary concerns had been that, the TMCs were accepted sometimes only into one concentration and not into the ones that students are really interested in. So is that really access for students? Okay, it had some other provisions about a redirection process for application and about a marketing strategy, but we can get into those later if they come up in questions. Okay, so what this study does is we sort of assess the progress since those reviews. So we use the LAO as kind of the baseline for our review. We looked at what has happened in the last couple of years in terms of the implementation. It's still a little too early to evaluate the actual impact on student outcomes. So we are, again, still looking at how the implementation is going. So our methods included reviewing public data on, the number of degrees that everybody's offering and, how many of them the CSUs are accepting and into what majors and concentrations. We conducted over 70 interviews with administrators, faculty, and staff across both systems. So at the chancellor's office levels, statewide academic senates, and also within 6 campuses in each system, so 12 campuses total, 6 in each, okay? We also conducted a survey of student leaders in the California Community College system, okay? So I will first cover sort of recent progress that we've seen. So what we have found is that over the last couple of years, the number of transfer degrees offered at the community colleges has grown tremendously. So the green bars are kind of, this is basically a figure that was in the LAO report. We've just added the orange bars to show how it's different now. So at the time of the LAO's report, only 15 colleges had adopted 6 or more out of these, the available TMCs. But now 91 colleges have adopted 6 or more. So what you really need is a different scale to see the level of progress. So what we find now is that nearly half, or 54 of the colleges, offer at least 10. And again, it's out of 25 possible degrees. Those colleges account for 59% of transfers to the CSU system. So they're, a little less than half of colleges, but they sort of disproportionately are the ones that send transfers to CSU. There are, however, as you can see, a number of colleges that still offer only a few degrees. 14 offer 2 or 3 degrees. 58, which is more than half, offer less than 10. And this is a combination of different kinds of colleges. So it is some small rural colleges like Barstow, that you might expect would offer fewer, but it is also some very large colleges in urban areas like Contra Costa College and most of the colleges in the LA Community College District. Okay? So while significant progress has been made, there continue to be some issues of access to, to this pathway by students in particular areas, okay? What we also found is that offering the degrees and actually awarding them to students are 2 different things. So there's been a growth, some growth certainly in the award of degrees. 800 of them were awarded across the whole system in 2011-12, which was the first year they were available, and there weren't very many of them available that year. And that rose to 5,400 in 2012-13, the second year. So there's been a total of about 6,200 of them awarded over the first 2 years of implementation, or an average of about 55 awarded to students per college. But again, like in everything about this reform, there's a lot of variation across colleges. So as you can see, 10 colleges, with the little orange bars again being the most recent year, still offered they didn't actually award any of them. Another 25 awarded less than 10 individual students a transfer degree. And then there's a handful of colleges who awarded over 250 of them, including Pasadena City College, Fullerton, Citrus, and Diablo Valley. So 15 colleges accounted for half of all of the transfer degrees awarded in the first 2 years. Okay, and as you would think, the more, it tends to be the case that the more you offer, the more of the 25 that you offer, the more opportunities you have to award them to students, but that's not entirely what this is about. Okay, so for example, Butte College offers 17 of these degrees out of the 25. Moore Park offers 19 out of the 25. But Butte has only awarded 18 total degrees in 2 years, while Moore Park has awarded 239. So what we conclude from this is, clearly developing and approving these degrees at the community colleges is itself not sufficient to make this a successful reform. That's only step one. Okay? So that's the circumstances in the community colleges. So alignment of these degrees to majors at the CSU is another critical part of this. Again, just as a reminder, a TMC is defined as the 18 units of major preparation coursework that's included in each of these degrees. So, and each CSU looks at these TMCs and decides if it's similar enough to its major in that discipline. Basically, that means, can students complete that degree within 60 more units, because that's what the legislation requires. And just as context, requirements for a bachelor's degree in sociology, I don't know why I keep picking that one, but whatever, can vary across CSU campuses. Requirements can vary across options within a major. Business has lots of options at the CSUs, and the requirements can vary for those options. And then a few campuses have extra graduation requirements, like my own campus, Sac State, has a foreign language requirement. So they can't necessarily assume that students will transfer in having already met that, so they have to think, okay, within that 60 units, can they fit a foreign language requirement into those 60, okay? So basically, again, we have found significant progress at CSU from the time of the LAO report, which is, again, this is just a repeat of the LAO graph. Theirs is the sort of greenish bars and ours are the orange ones. Okay, and as context, at the time the LAO did their report 2 years ago, there were only 18 TMCs, and now there are 25. Okay, so it's actually sort of even more progress than it looks like. Okay, so right now, a third of CSU campuses accept all the TMCs as similar to at least one option in a major. Okay, and that's not that much different here than it was at the time of the LAO report. But 11 campuses now accept at least 90%, but not 100% of all the TMCs as similar, and that's like 3 times higher than it was at the time of the LAO report. So we also examined sort of how broadly the TMCs are accepted into concentrations in majors, and that table is actually not in the report. It's in a technical appendix, but there is an indicator of that you can see, and we have found in that improvement as well since the LAO report, but again, some continuing issues of access. For example, as just one example, Cal State San Marcos accepts the business administration TMC, but they only accept it into their economics major. They don't take it into any of the concentrations in business, which is probably what students doing a business administration associate's degree for transfer want to go into. Okay, but again, as evidence of progress, that used to be the case at Cal State Fullerton as well. And now they accept that TMC into both economics and international business and almost all, not all, but almost all of the options within their business administration. So there has been progress. Okay. So I mentioned that we conducted lots and lots of interviews, some of the people being in the room that we interviewed. And we did that because faculty and staff are instrumental in implementing this policy, and their reactions to it are really critical to its success. And so what we find overall is that opinions about it across the two systems are mixed. Most people see it as, in general, an improvement. Oh, whoops, sorry about that. An improvement over the, former transfer system. But they, constantly say, but, there's always caveats on that. It really only applies to a subset of students. Okay, there's lots of agreement across the two systems about what is good about this reform. They see the consistent requirements in these TMCs and the degrees as making things easier for students, and in theory, making it easier for advisors. They definitely see the alignment of transfer with associate degree requirements as being a positive thing, and the guarantees being a good thing for students, particularly the sort of, all 60 units will transfer and you can't be required to repeat more courses. And what we consistently heard from everybody across both systems was that the reform has sparked really important conversations across campuses within systems, across the two systems, in a discipline about what does it mean to get a degree in this discipline? What is it that's really essential to have as lower division major preparation? And that those conversations didn't have really a forum before, or they certainly didn't take place a lot before, and that has been valuable. And faculty have used those conversations to review their own curriculum and make updates to what they were doing. Now, we did find some difference in views between the two systems on what is not so good, in people's opinion, about the reform. As just, a couple of examples, in the community colleges, people tend to emphasize that, this is supposed to be a statewide pathway, it's promoted that way. It's not really. And that is for a couple of reasons. One is that the UC does not participate. And that makes it very complicated for students to decide whether they should do one of these degrees. If they want to keep open the option of maybe going to a UC, but maybe, going to a CSU, should I do one of these or not? And that confusion extends to counselors and advisors. Should I tell students they should do one of these, or should I not? Okay. Other things we heard commonly in the community colleges as sort of more negative comments was that it has disrupted some local, patterns and things that they see as working really well, and it has been in some places to the detriment of their students. Particularly, we heard that from community colleges that are feeders into the more impacted CSUs. Okay, and also there was lots of complaints about the 18-unit major thing, and that maybe that was not the best way to go for students. Requires them to get on a pathway way earlier than community college students are ready to do. In the CSU, people emphasized as sort of a negative thing that it doesn't address what they see as the biggest problem in transfer, which is inadequate advising at the community colleges. They said that even with these sort of more statewide consistent patterns, students need good advising. They need to be tracked to see if they're on track to do this, and that these are not things that typically go on a lot in the community college system. Other complaints or negative comments we heard from people in the CSU were that the focus on efficiency at all costs, the reduction to 60 units here and 60 units there, may affect quality, and that sometimes maybe you need more than that. Okay? We also heard them say over and over that the GPA bump is not really an effective mechanism. It's sort of this, students are supposed to be given priority in admission to the CSU if they have one of these degrees. The way they do that is they assign them like a little bump to their GPA. And people uniformly pretty much thought that isn't working very well. Okay. So, and in both systems, people acknowledged that there was quite a bit of initial resistance to this reform. That it was seen as sort of a statewide approach being imposed on what was traditionally local curricular decisions, and that the degree of that resistance varied across campuses and even across departments within campuses. But most people seem to think that that has sort of dissipated over time with the continuing focus on this by the chancellor's offices in both systems. Some might put that as pressure from the chancellor's offices in both systems, but people definitely think that the momentum has been building over time for it. Okay. People also talked a lot about how complicated this has been to implement, that policymakers and people in Sacramento don't get how hard this is for them to do and don't appreciate, how far they've come. So in the community colleges, the curriculum review and approval process for new degrees can be lengthy and vary substantially across colleges. So that slows things down. Everybody said that the 60-unit limit has required a lot of hard work on their part to figure out how to reduce their degrees, to 60 units. And in the community colleges, even how to reduce the units in some classes, like math and English classes that had creeped up over the years to being 4-unit or 5-unit classes. You have to, how to reduce them down to 3-unit classes so that then you could stay within the 60 unit. So that all takes time and a lot of faculty work and effort to do. And this was all being done at a time when their budgets were being cut, making it really difficult for them to allocate faculty and staff time to the effort. And again, lastly, both systems talked about there being this lack of infrastructure in place that would have made this easier. So some examples of that are, common course numbering across the two systems. No such thing exists. There's not even common course numbering across CSUs, and it's only now being worked on in the community college system. So that made it challenging for people to figure out whether their curriculum actually matched these TMCs or not. Okay, again, one of the big things people talk about is there's no way currently to track students' degree intent at the community colleges. Often the first time they know a student wants to earn a degree is when they apply for it. So that is not very helpful for the purposes of advising them all along on how to stay on this pathway. And it really complicates the effort for CSU to do what it's required to do, which is to give priority consideration to the application for admission to students who are going to earn these degrees. Because they apply before they've actually earned it. So they have to know, is this student on track? Are they going to earn it? And there is no consistent way to do that. Each pair of community college and CSU has pretty much had to figure out how to do this. And it's often, from descriptions I heard, this really inefficient process of manually reviewing students' transcripts to see if they've got all the courses and they're enrolled in them, and signing a sheet and making them hand carry that to a CSU that they've applied to, which is completely ridiculous and inefficient. And so people uniformly said the chancellor's offices should be helping us figure out how to do something that's more automated and system-wide for this process. Okay? Finally, the last kind of thing we did that I mentioned was we surveyed student leaders in the community colleges, and what we found was that student awareness of these degrees is limited. While student leaders are generally more aware of sort of big policy changes in the community colleges than our typical community college students, we found that over a third of the people we interviewed had never even heard of them. And that being the case, despite the fact that 90% of them said transfer was their goal. Okay? So most who said they had heard of them claimed not to understand them very well. They said that they didn't really understand how this pathway differs from any other pathway. And they did not think that what their colleges had done to try to inform students about it was very effective. They also believe that awareness among the general student population is even lower than among the student leaders. Okay, this confirmed what people in the system, the administrators, faculty, and staff at the institutions told us. They recognize that students are largely unaware of this, that they're confused about it. And while they could list various things they've done, we've put it in our catalog, and we have these flyers in the transfer office or whatever, people pretty much acknowledged that this has not been enough. The people at the system levels talked about how they went out and got some grants to do marketing and communication, but that had been insufficient. And so, that they thought more was needed to be done. And what we also found was that despite students not knowing that much about these degrees, among those who had a goal of transfer, there was more interest in them than you would think. About half of them said, yeah, I'm interested in it. And those who weren't basically said they weren't interested because their college didn't offer one in their major, or because they weren't planning to go to CSU, or basically they just didn't know enough about it to say they'd be interested or not. Okay. So next I'll talk about some work we did sort of assessing these pathways. So in order to be useful, these degrees should be offered in areas that students want. So what we looked at was the patterns of transfer activity by discipline and the share of bachelor's degrees awarded by discipline. In recent years, we used some archived CPEC data for that, so it was like 2008 to 10 activity that we looked at. So we found that system-wide, the disciplines that are covered by these 25 TMCs account for more than 70% of transfer activity to the CSU, so the vast majority, but that varies for individual campuses. Okay, so this is just a few community colleges. There's a table in the report that's got more of them, but I'll just kind of walk you through how to read it. So Fullerton College, for example, offers 18 of these degrees. Those 18 degrees cover 69% of the transfer activity to the CSU was in those disciplines, and 73% of the BAs awarded by CSU to students who transferred from Fullerton College were in those disciplines. Kind of on the other end of the scale, LA Mission College offers only 3 transfer degrees, which only covers 8% of the transfers to CSU and 7% of the BAs awarded to LA Mission College transfer students. So as you'd expect, the more degrees they offer, typically the more coverage there is of the transfer activity, but that's not entirely the case. If you look at Orange Coast and Butte, they offer very similar numbers of degrees, and yet it covers 62% of transfers at Orange Coast, but less than half at Butte. So what this tells us is that the 25 TMCs cover the bulk of transfer activity from the community colleges to the CSU, but it's affected by the decisions each community college is making about how many and which ones of these degrees to offer. We looked at something similar at the CSU campuses, and again, this is just a few of them, and there's a table in the report that shows them all. So I am going to use San Francisco in the middle as an example, okay? San Francisco offers majors in all 25 of the areas where there's a TMC, and they accept 24 of them. Okay, the one they do not accept is the journalism TMC, but journalism only accounts for 2% of the bachelor's degrees awarded. So that is the difference between the 70% in the first column, the second column, and the 68%. So for the most part, these degrees cover most of the transfer activity, but it's kind of an overestimate. It understates the problem of access to majors because you cannot look at the concentrations within majors. The data aren't good enough to get down into the concentrations, and as I said before, the TMCs might be accepted only into 1 out of 11, concentrations in something. So this is an overstatement in that case. So as an example of that, Cal State East Bay, you see on there, it's second line, it looks like it's perfect, right? They offer 24 of these majors. That covers 77% of their bachelor's degrees awarded. They accept all 24 of them. So that means 77% of their degrees are awarded in things that they accept. But they only accept the business TMC into the corporate management option of their business major. And they have 11 other options within that major that don't take it. I don't know the share of degrees that they award in corporate management versus the other options because that data isn't available. I would imagine it's pretty small. And that affects community college student access this way because over a quarter of all the BAs they award are in business. Okay, so the access is not as good as this table would make it look like it is. So to get to some overall conclusions, we've organized this by those sort of 4 goals that we talked about of the 2 pieces of legislation. So first, the goal about creating clearer pathways that would reduce units and increase capacity to serve more students. We definitely see that the fact that faculty have worked together across campus and system lines will establish a legacy of clearer pathways, aside from any impact on units or capacity. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit more about units and capacity in a minute, but definitely pathways would seem to be clearer. Okay, the second goal about the associate degree completion increasing, we definitely think that more students who are transferring should complete associate degrees now that the 2 requirements are aligned. Okay, but some of the incentives for students to take this pathway may not be effective as we would like them to be. The guarantee of admission somewhere in the system may not be that compelling for students who want to just go to their local CSU, especially if that's one of the most impacted ones, or if they, have a particular CSU that they want to go to. So that might not be that compelling for them. The GPA bump, which was, uniformly pretty much told us that is not very effective, it might not be a good enough incentive for students. It's also impeded by the lack of student awareness that I talked about and about the lack of administrative structures to support this. So the number of transfers may increase. There's certainly potential for that, given that these pathways match up really well to sort of historical student interest in transferring. But our primary concern there is that we're not clear that CSU has the capacity to accept large increased numbers of transfer students. And the admission guarantee to somewhere may be increasingly difficult to actually implement. Okay, and finally, on establishing this as the preferred path to transfer, there's limits to that. Primarily, the fact that it has no path to to UC limits its appeal, as does this continuing complication of which concentrations in which majors at which CSUs will use them, will also limit the extent to which this is the chosen pathway to get there. And it is also limited by simply the profile of community college students. And I have a graphic to kind of display that, okay? So if you look down kind of the left side of this graphic, that represents the ideal pathway envisioned in SB 1440. It pretty much requires students to come in knowing what they want to major in. They have to know about this pathway. They got to know what they want to major in early. They have to decide early that CSU is their destination. They have to get accepted into a CSU that offers a similar program that's of interest to them and that they are willing to attend. And then once they get to the CSU, they have to avoid making certain choices that would kind of knock them off the pathway. That doesn't describe, as many of you from community colleges know, very many community college students. Okay? On the right side, you can see sort of all the ways, or some of the ways at least, that students can accumulate extra units. So if you don't know what your major is early, you might be taking courses that aren't going to end up fitting into one of these TMCs. Or, if the CSU you're interested in doesn't take it, you might take some of the courses that they have historically wanted students to take to transfer there to try to bolster your chances of admission and thereby also accumulating units. And not a lot of students, at the CSUs we interviewed had come in with these degrees yet, but we were told that it was pretty common for students who had to come in and do something that took them out of this pathway. Either they changed their major altogether, or they changed concentrations once they got in there and they learned about these other options. They changed which concentration they were going to be in, or they wanted to do a study abroad or add a minor or something that would take them out of this 60-unit guarantee. So what we think is that this calls for some realistic expectations about the extent to which this is really going to result in students following this ideal 60 plus 60 equals 120 efficient pathway to transfer. Okay? And we do make several recommendations to try to help it work a little bit better. First, we think that the CSU Chancellor's Office, probably with Academic Senate participation, should at this point do some kind of more formal review of those remaining not similar designations that are out there to see if those are really warranted and to assist campuses in figuring out how they might make it work. Okay, I know that I hear that has sort of informally gone on, but we think that maybe a sort of formal process of doing that at this point would be a good idea. They should also review that priority admission mechanism of the GPA bump to see if that's really doing what it's supposed to do. The Community College Chancellor's Office, we think, should coordinate efforts to help colleges share curricula and resources to be able to offer more degrees. It's just simply a fact that some of these small colleges don't offer all the courses that are in these 18 units in the TMCs, and they wouldn't have enough FTE to justify adding them, even if they had the faculty resources to teach them. There's got to be some better way to have them share courses across colleges, or using some of the online money that was in the recent governor's budget to make sure that you're including these courses in those that are going to be offered online, so that more of these smaller colleges can offer more of these transfer degrees. Okay. Both chancellor's offices should consider, from what we heard from people and what makes sense to us, course registration priority for students on this pathway. That is sort of the coin of the realm in both of these systems. Seats are limited. The earlier your registration priority date, the better chances you have. So if you can find a way to give priority course registration to students that are on this pathway, then that's gonna be a real incentive, we think, to students following it. Now, of course, that's very complicated in the community college system because they don't know. They don't currently track students by what it is they're intending to do so that they can track whether they're on their way to doing it. But that needs some work if we're going to make this work. We also think that both chancellor's offices need to work together to develop some kind of more standardized process of verifying degrees. Whether these students are almost there and should be given priority admission, rather than expecting the colleges to figure it out and to come up with all these haphazard ways of making students carry papers from one to another to get things signed off. That's just not efficient, and it's not working very well from what we were told. As far as what the legislature could do, we know they just recently passed SB 440 in the fall. But after the CSU Chancellor's Office reviewed these continuing sort of not similar designations, we think they might consider some legislation that allowed for some more flexibility at the upper division level. I can't tell you how many people told us if it was only 63 units we were allowed, or 66 units we were allowed, we could make so many more concentrations work with these TMCs. And do we really want to live or die on the success of this over 3 or 6 units? Probably not. So that is worth thinking about. And also, given that the stated goal of SB 440 is that this become the preferred transfer pathway for all students across the state, we think they should provide some funding to expand and coordinate efforts across the two systems to increase student awareness. Now, I'm no communications specialist. I don't know what that would necessarily look like, but something needs to be done, because just putting it in a catalog or putting a little box on the website or having some sheets in the transfer center is not sufficient. This is an entire shift in transfer culture, the way transfer has worked in California for decades. And so if you expect it to shift and for people to move toward using this as the primary pathway, you're going to have to make a bigger effort in order to do that. And that is going to extend to informing high schools. Students have to come in, as I said, knowing about this pathway. So you got to extend outreach to high schools. And you have to make sure that counselors fully understand this, because they currently do not. They're confused about when they should be advising students to do it and when they shouldn't. And so that needs to be worked on. Okay? And finally, we think that there should be an intensification of efforts to extend this pathway to UC. You know, it's really just the case that it's hard for students, if they want to keep that option open, to think that this is a good pathway for them. And, you know, maybe even to some of the private universities. So any efforts to extend it, I think, would be helpful. Okay? And that's it.